Today we are, please God, going to learn two Mishnahs, which is quite an achievement. But the reason for that is because the two Mishnahs run into each other. One of the things that we're doing at the moment, this section of Pirkei Avos, is what we call zugois, where the people are introduced to us as couples, partners. So what that means is that they were halachically partners. That means to say that they each had roles, complementary roles in the community. Typically, the first person who is mentioned is what we call the Nasi, the person who's the head of the Jewish community at the time. And the second one is what we call the Av Beis Din, the person who was the head of the judiciary. So those are the two roles that we come across. In this particular case, the two people we're going to meet, the roles kind of switch over the course of time. It's one of the things that we're going to speak about, and it does play into the lessons that they're going to teach us. So there was a very dramatic moment in the relationship between these two rabbis. Before we actually start the two Mishnahs, let's just introduce the characters, because it is helpful to know who we're talking about. So we're going to learn today about an individual called Yehuda ben Tabai. He's the author of the first Mishnah. And Shimon ben Shotach, who is the author of the second Mishnah. And as I say, they were partners, they collaborated, they had a lot of interaction, not only in their formal roles, but also in the way that they shared Torah together, as we shall see. So before we read what they have to say, here's just a little bit of a background. Unfortunately, some of the characters in the early part of Pirkei Avos, we don't have a tremendously big biographical insight. So Yehuda ben Tabai, for example, there's not a whole lot of information available about him on a personal level, but here's something that is really interesting, and it speaks to the heart of Jewish leadership. You know, in our world, in order to become a leader, a community leader, and certainly a political leader, you have to sell yourself. You've got to basically convince people why you should be the leader, right? That's how it works. That's what politics is. Vote for me, I'm amazing, I'm going to make your life fantastic. In Jewish circles and in Jewish history, it's exactly the opposite way around. To us, the most appropriate person to be a leader is the person who does not want the position. So if you look at Moshe Rabbeinu as the primary example, of course, so Moses himself, here was the person who was going to be the original Jewish leader, the ultimate Jewish leader, the person who was going to take us out of Egypt, amazing things, receive the Torah on our behalf, and it's like really, really powerful stuff. He doesn't want the job. So we're going to see that there's a similar thing with Yehuda ben Tabai. Yehuda ben Tabai, they wanted him, the Jews wanted him to be the head of their community, to be the Nasi, to be the leader, the spiritual leader, the political leader, basically the primary mover and shaker in the Jewish world. And he didn't want it. Now, you know how it is in the Jewish world, right? When a person is offered a position, we don't take no sitting down. If we think that a person is suited to the position, we know how to nag them, we know how to drive them mashuga, and that's exactly what happened. So they drove him absolutely mashuga to take this position. And eventually it became such a pressure that he ran away and he moved to Alexandria in Egypt to avoid having to become the Nasi. But if you think that that's going to dissuade the people, not at all. They chased him. And they chased him all the way to Alexandria in Egypt. And once they found him, they managed to convince him to take the position. And that is, in fact, how Yehuda ben Tabai became the head, the Nasi, the head of the Jewish community. Now, it was a very difficult time. When these two individuals lived, Shimon ben Shotach and Yehuda ben Tabai, was an incredibly difficult time historically for the Jewish people, and for two primary reasons. The first is that, remember, we already touched on this previously, that at this period in history, there's a great split in the Jewish world. So let's just go back one or two steps, see the background of that split, and understand what was going on at this point. After the Hanukkah story, which wasn't too long before this, the family of the Hashmonaim, otherwise known as the Maccabees, were the big heroes of the Jewish people. And for good reason. They had done an amazing thing. They had stood up to an incredibly powerful and belligerent power, and they brought about a huge miracle. And the direct result of that miracle was the restoration of full service in the Beis Hamikdash. It was a massive thing that they had done. And they remain our heroes until today. Nobody would, God forbid, suggest for 1 minute that the Hashmonai family were bad people, and certainly not the original family, because they established Chanukah for us. So that tells you that they're endorsed by the highest levels of Yiddishkeit. Unfortunately, though, their children went off the rails. You could almost say that the power went to their head. Because they had become heroes and because everybody looked after them, they decided inappropriately that they should start a royal dynasty of their own. Now, according to Torah law, the only acceptable royal dynasty in Judaism has to be from the tribe of Yehuda, the Davidic dynasty. And they were Kohanim. So that's the wrong tribe, wrong dynasty, and wrong role. The role of a Kohen is to serve on behalf of the Jewish people in the Beis HaMikdash and the temple. In fact, we're going to read about that in this week's parasha, about how the Kohanim and the Leviim have to represent us in service. So to take on that kind of leadership and to become the royal family of the Jewish people at the time was wrong. They should never have done it. But they did. And as a direct result of that, unfortunately, their children, their descendants, had a major break from Judaism. And it's terribly tragic because exactly the things that the Hashmonaim fought for are exactly the things that their children rejected. Namely, the authenticity of Torah in its orthodox form, in its classic form. In other words, the acceptance not only of Scripture, but very importantly, of Torah Shabbal Peh, the oral Torah as well. And they began to reject that. Now, we learned in the Mishnah of Antignos, remember that he had two students. One was called Tzadok and one was called Baitos. And they didn't like what he was saying, and they had the impression that there's no reward and there's no world to come. And they went off and started a fringe splinter movement called the Tzedukim, the Sadducees. And unfortunately, many of the leadership of the Hashmonai family down the generations became part of the Sadducee movement, the Tzedukim. Where we are in history right now, when we're dealing with these two personalities, Yehuda ben Tabai and Shimon ben Shotach, is a time where there's a raging war between the Prushim, which is what you and I would consider normative Judaism, people who accepted the Torah in its written and oral forms, and the Tzedukim, who were the political leadership at the time and held a lot of power, and they were with their agenda to go down the Tzeduki route. And the Tzeduki route included a whole lot of things that you and I would look at and say, never, that's not Judaism. So Yehuda ben Tabai and Shimon ben Shotach had to fight against this. At the time, the person who was the leader of the Hashmonai dynasty, who was very belligerent to the rabbinic leadership, was a person called Yanai Malka, Yanai the king. And he was on such a mission to uproot rabbinic Judaism that he persecuted the Rabbanim. And many, if not most of them, ran away and left Israel. If you can imagine this, can you imagine a period in history where rabbis run from Israel not because of the invasive forces of some belligerent nation, not the Romans and not the Greeks and not the Crusaders, but their fellow Jews who were on a mission to try and destroy them and their teachings, and people ran. The only person who successfully remained in Israel at the time was Shimon ben Shotach. The reason he was able to remain is because he was related to the queen, Shlom Tzion, the queen. They were related. There's a bit of debate exactly what the nature of that relationship was, if they were siblings or if it was a more distant relationship, but either way, she provided him with immunity, and that's why he was able to stay. And eventually, when things settled down, he sent coded messages to the other sages that it was now safe to return to Israel. In any event, Yehuda ben Tabai and Shimon ben Shotach, as the Nasi and the head of the judiciary, the Av Beis Din respectively, they had a responsibility now. The responsibility was, number one, to consolidate normative Judaism, to keep Judaism alive. So much so that the Talmud says, Shimon ben Shotach, it's thanks to him that Judaism was not lost at that period in time. That means he fought tooth and nail. I mean, it wasn't an easy thing. That means that he did all kinds of things. He put takonos, all kinds of enactments, decrees in place in order to keep Judaism wholesome. Part of what they had to do was to fight the notions that the Tzedukim, the Sadducees, had fed into the community to prove that those things were not valid. And one of the things that they fought against became a huge point of contention between these two sages themselves. So here they are, they're on a mission to try and push back against the Tzedukim. It's good intentions. They want to consolidate and save Judaism, and it actually lands up becoming a point of conflict between the two of them. And as a result of that particular conflict, they actually switch roles at some point. Yehuda ben Tabai steps down and says, I defer to the authority of Shimon ben Shotach, and we'll see what that story is all about. So that's one of the big things that happened at that time. There's another big thing that happened at that time. If we didn't have enough tzoros from the fact that there was this uprising of the Tzedukim and their rejection of normative Judaism, we had another problem at the time as well, and that is that for whatever reason, punkt, at exactly the same time, there was a predisposition amongst Jewish people to engage in what is called kishuf, which is basically sorcery, black magic, witchcraft. Now, I mean, it's a bizarre thing. You would imagine that Jews are a little bit smarter than that. Maybe if you had a talk in the early years of the prophets, when people were still very much idolatrous, you can understand that Jews got sucked into the worship of Baal and bowing down to Asherah trees and whatever happened to be popular at that time. But we're on the other end of history here. We're at the point where the second Beis Hamikdash is already a few hundred years in. That means that the Jews had been in Israel for a long time. They had heard from the prophets. They had learned things. They had great sages. They had experienced what happens when you don't listen. They had gone into exile. They had come back from the exile. Really you would expect at this point in time that they would actually know what to do and how to think. So it's incredibly surprising that there was this movement of kishuf, of sorcery, and its epicenter was in Ashkelon. So again, one of the big stories that happens, and bear in mind the history, the stories, the events that occurred in these rabbis' lives influenced the teachings that they prioritized. So it's a big issue that happens at that time with the witches at that time, and it's going to influence the attitude of Shimon ben Shotach. Okay, so that's a little bit of the background to what's going on, who the people are, what their roles are, and what was going on historically at the time. With that in mind, we can actually have a look at the two Mishnahs, which go as follows. Yehuda ben Tabai, this is Mishnah number 8. Yehuda ben Tabai v'Shimon ben Shotach kiblu mehem. So there you got the two people, Yehuda ben Tabai, Shimon ben Shotach. They accepted the oral tradition, or they received the oral tradition from their predecessors, who were Nitai Bailey and Yoshua ben Prachia. So let's first see Yehuda ben Tabai Omer. Yehuda ben Tabai, you will notice that both of their statements are specifically around the court system. There's a very important reason for this, because you have to understand what was going on at that time. At that time, the whole battle raged around the Jewish court system. In other words, where are you going to fight? If the Tzedukim at the time, who rejected the values of Torah as we know it, where's the fight going to happen? It's going to happen in the courts. We think your ruling is wrong. We think that the way that you've interpreted this verse is wrong. So that's the battlefield of that time. That's why you will notice that the core teachings of Yehuda ben Tabai and Shimon ben Shotach are teachings about the court system, because that was their reality. That's what they were dealing with. So what does Yehuda ben Tabai say? Al ta'as atzmecha ke'orchei hadayonim. If you are a judge, you'll notice his entire Mishnah is directed to the person who is the judge. So he says, if you're the judge in the court system, don't act like a lawyer. Now, it's a whole question whether or not you can have a lawyer in Judaism. So that expression, orchei hadayonim, in modern Hebrew we would say an orech din. An orech din, which is the singular version of that expression, is a lawyer. But in halacha, that word orchei is usually, in halachic terms, used in a negative light. Arkaois. So we're told that we as Jewish people are not meant to take our legal issues to arkaois. Arkaois is the secular, non-Jewish legal system. So there's an insinuation over here. He's not only just saying, don't be like a lawyer, he's actually implying that the lawyer system is not a Jewish system. So how does the Jewish system work? You have a judge who presides, but he never presides alone. Again, in the secular system, you often have a single judge. But in the Jewish system, you can never have fewer than 3 judges. So that's already a core difference between how things work. Then, in the Jewish court system, as we'll see in a minute from Shimon ben Shatach, in the Jewish court system, it's whoever the parties are, they have to present their version of the case directly to the court. You cannot have a lawyer stand up on your behalf because he happens to know the ins and outs of the law and tell your story. In Jewish law, you have to tell your own story. Those two personalities, or more personalities, they're called Ba'alei Hadin. So you're going to see in a second that Yehuda ben Tabai uses that expression, Ba'alei Hadin, the people who are the litigants. The only other people who have a voice in the court are the eyewitnesses to the event. They're going to pop up in Shimon ben Shatach's Mishnah, where he's going to talk about how you should interact with and how you should relate to the Eidim, the witnesses. So in Jewish law, the way that the court system works is you have multiple judges, always an odd number, so that you can always have a majority. You have the litigants and eyewitnesses. That's who plays the roles in the Jewish court. So between the two, Yehuda ben Tabai and Shimon ben Shatach, they have a message to the judge, they have a message about the litigants, and they have a message about how to treat the witnesses. So basically, they're talking to the judges. So what does Yehuda ben Tabai say? He says, Al tas atzmecho ke'orchei hadayonim. You as the judge should never play the role of a lawyer. Well, what does a lawyer do? A lawyer basically says, my client says X and Y. My client at this particular time was whatever. In other words, the lawyer actually has an insight into the case that the judge does not have. And based on that, that's why you pay a lawyer, right? You tell the lawyer your side of the story, and the goal of the lawyer is to convince the judge of the truth of your side of the story. That's his whole role, right? So in Jewish law, that's objectionable. In Jewish law, nobody is supposed to hear any side of the case until the case is in court. So the concept of an oirech din in halacha, Yehuda ben Tabai says, that's objectionable. How can you do that? How can you allow somebody to have insight into the case that may give him a prejudice, a bias against the other person? Because he knows information about one side of the case. And the Torah is clear about that you may never have insight into one side of the case first. Now, if you do that, what's going to happen is you're going to lead the witness. You're going to lead the litigant because you have a bias already. You have information, you have insight that you're going to say, so please tell me in your version, right? That's what lawyers do. So Yehuda ben Tabai tells the judge, don't play that game. You have to be absolutely impartial. So when people present information to you, take that information as it is presented and don't try and push people to say certain things or lead them to speak in a certain way. That is actually a miscarriage of justice. That's number one. We'll come back to that. Then he says, when the two litigants stand before you, so you're now the judge, right? And you've got Reuven and Shimon, and they come along, and Reuven says he stole money from me, and Shimon says, I don't know what you're talking about, I've never met you in my life, or whatever the particular thing is. You know how it is once Jews are in front of a court, or anybody for that matter. Once you're in front of a court, suddenly memory becomes very, very specific. So when the two people are standing in front of you, Yiyu be'einecha kirishoim, you should view them both equally as guilty. In other words, until such time as you've heard the two sides, don't make a judgment and say, well, that guy looks like he's a pretty decent human being. That one I'm not so sure about. So this guy's probably right. Never take that attitude. Take the attitude that both of them are equally guilty. Now, let's move from that position forward. If they can prove otherwise, right, guilty until proven innocent, we'll go with that. In other words, as Jews, you and I, when we look at the next person, we're not allowed to take this attitude. Our attitude surely has to be innocent until proven guilty, right? Isn't that how we're supposed to look at people? You know what they say the difference is between a Jewish person and an anti-Semite? You know the difference? Lahavdil. They say that an anti-Semite, you speak to them and they say, all Jews are crooks, the Jews just want to control the world, the Jews are terrible people. Aye, but your doctor is Dr. Cohen. Dr. Cohen is an exception. Dr. Cohen's a decent guy. Speak to your average Jewish person, what do they say? All Jews are amazing. Amazing. We're the best people in the world, most Nobel Prizes. So look how we turned the desert into this beautiful, flourishing country. We have brought so much good to the world. We're good people. You have a faribel with Dr. Cohen. Dr. Cohen is an exception. Dr. Cohen is not such a nice guy. Jews generally are good. He's just, So normally Torah tells us that's an inappropriate attitude. Innocent until proven guilty. You have to look at a person and judge them favorably. That's how you're supposed to look. But if you're a judge in the court system, this is not a time for being nice. This is a time for looking for truth. So therefore he says that they should appear before you as if they are both guilty. But listen to what he says next. When they leave you after you've ruled and the court case is now over and they exit your courtroom, now you, the same judge, looking at the same people, you now have the responsibility to look at them as if they are both zakoin. That means decent people, good people, people who have done the right thing. Why? Because they've accepted your judgment. And that's really the purpose, right? Why did they come to the court? To hear what the judge has to say. But there's a beautiful insight into this. He said, what kind of a game is this? You look at the person, one minute you think he's completely guilty because now you've got to judge the case. The next minute you look at the same person, you say, oh, amazing, Zakai, wonderful person. Why? Because he accepted the judgment. What does that actually mean? So the meaning is this. We never know what a person was thinking or feeling, even when we can judge what they did. There's an expression in the Gemara that goes, Ein ledayin ela masha eino v'ro'os. A judge can only judge based on what his eyes see. In other words, the facts as they are presented in front of him. But Hashem yireh leleivav. Hashem knows what's going on inside a person's heart. That means that even when a situation comes before the court, and you review all of the evidence, and you decide that a particular person is guilty, you can only decide that they are guilty of what they did. But you can never know what their intention had been. And perhaps their intention was not malicious, even if their behavior was. Maybe they were misguided in their thinking. Maybe they had some kind of a distraction at the time. Maybe they had misinterpreted the law. Who knows? There are a whole lot of reasons why a person may have done something which in action is wrong. And nevertheless, they might not be wicked for having done it. That's what Yehuda ben Tabai wants to teach us. He wants to teach us that at the moment where you release them from your custody as the judge and you let them back into the world and you say, you have now accepted my judgment, I will not hold it against you as a person. We don't judge people based on actions. This is an incredibly important thing to know, that the court system is to judge behavior and to assign a consequence to behavior. It is not a judge of character. And this is something which I think people get confused about very often, especially around certain very subtle, touchy topics. Say, for example, there's certain relationships that in today's world are completely acceptable, but the Torah does not accept them. It rejects those relationships out of hand. The Torah does not have a name for the person in that relationship. It only has a description of the forbidden action. The person is Zakaya. The person is a decent, wholesome, good person. They are misguided in this particular area of life. And yes, Torah prescribes a particular consequence for that kind of behavior, but it does not prescribe a stigma of the person because of that behavior. Incredibly important to keep in mind. Also, what's Yehuda ben Tabai telling you and I? So we're not judges. We don't preside on the court bench. So what's his message to us? Because Pirkei Avos is not a book written only for an exclusive group of the upper echelon of Judaism. It's a book for the average Jewish person, us included. So what's the message? Al ta'as atzmecha ka'orchei hadayonim. Don't make yourself into a lawyer. Orchei hadayonim, the word oreich means to lay out. Like Shulchan Aruch. Right? It means to lay something out. Don't become the person who lays out judgment on other people. Don't. You're not a judge. So yes, there's a rule for the judges that they should see everybody as guilty until proven innocent. But you, altas atzmecha ka'orchai dayanim, ordinary person, don't judge people. It's not the way to behave as a Jewish person. Let's go now to Shimon ben Shatach. Mishnah number 9. Shimon ben Shatach oimer. Shimon ben Shatach says, Have a marbe lachkor es ha'edim. You should be very, very involved. The marbe means to increase. So you should increase your cross-examination of witnesses. According to Torah law, there are 7 major themes of cross-examination that a judge has to put a witness through before he can accept his testimony. And then over and above those 7 categories, he is at liberty, the judge is at liberty to add as many kinds of cross-examination as he possibly wants to ensure that the testimony is accurate. Because in Judaism, we don't want just, what do they call, what's it called? Circumstantial evidence. We don't want that. We want absolute testimony. So that's number 1. Number 2, you should be very careful with your words. In case out of your words, they, the witnesses or the litigants, are able to come up with a lie. In other words, if you, the judge, pose a question in the wrong way, if you're not careful how you say the words, you might actually give them the opportunity to lie under oath or to lie in the Beis Din, and that is a problem. Okay, so they're both talking clearly to the judges. Yehuda ben Tabai, an attitude that the judge should take towards the litigants. Shimon ben Shatach, a technique that the judge should use when cross-examining. Now, what could that teach us? Shimon ben Shatach's lesson actually has a lot to teach us, and before we can do that, we have to understand a little bit of context. There are 2 stories that inform Shimon ben Shatach's attitude. 2 stories that happened, both of them have to do with the major issues that were going on in the community at the time. Number 1, we had like I said, there was the breakaway, there were the Tzedukkim, the Sadducees, and they wanted to invent their own version of Judaism. Unfortunately, that's something that happens from time to time. I don't think that it's even, not an issue today. So the Tzedukkim, one of the big things that they fought the rabbis against was a principle in Torah called Eidim Zoimamin. You know what this is, Eidim Zoimamin? It's a very, very interesting concept. So listen to this. In Judaism, the only way that we can accept testimony is with eyewitnesses. In order to verify that these eyewitnesses can speak in the court, we need to know some basic things. Like, did you really see what you say you saw? The job of the judge, as Yehuda ben Tabai says, as Shimon ben Shatach says, is have a marbe lachkor es ha'edim. You need to really cross-examine those witnesses because you have to understand, are they telling the truth? Is it feasible that they saw what they claim to have seen? That's what has to happen. So now, let's say that we interview those witnesses, and it turns out that the 2 witnesses, because there's always a minimum of 2 witnesses in Jewish law, that their stories are contradictory, because we'll cross-examine them individually. If their stories are contradictory, boom, we throw the case out of court, we call them Eidei Sheker, they're obviously lying, and that's it, no case. But there's a unique situation called Eidim Zoimamin that the Torah describes in detail. And Eidim Zoimamin means this. Their stories are 100% in line with each other. They're synchronized completely, except for one detail. One detail. We have other witnesses who can prove that these 2 people were not at the place that the crime happened at the time that they claim they saw it happen. So we don't find falsehood in their testimony. We find external evidence to the fact that these guys could never have been there. It's called the Imonu Hayisem principle. 2 other witnesses and say, but you could never have been at the Norwood Mall at that time. You were with us breaking the lockdown rules at Kosher World. So that on that basis, the halacha is Va'asisem loy kashezomam la'asos le'achiv. It's a very unique law. The Torah says if these witnesses are proven now to have no basis to their testimony because they were not physically present, then the court has to apply to them the same punishment that they thought would apply to the so-called criminal. So these two people rock up in court and they say, Reuven murdered Shimon at 3 p.m. in the lounge using a candlestick. So two other witnesses come along and they say, that is impossible because at that time you were actually on a Kahoot game with us on Zoom and we saw the background of your house and you clearly were home. So the punishment for murder is the death penalty. So it's an incredible halacha that says that we now apply the death penalty to those two witnesses. Because they wanted to kill somebody who was actually innocent, they get killed instead. The Tzedukim said that only applies if the Beis Din had already executed the accused. Then, as retribution, we execute the witnesses. But Torah Shebal Peh says clearly that the Torah says, "Va'asisem loy," you do to this person, kasher zomam, as they had schemed, loy kasher asa, not as they had already done. In other words, our tradition is that the only time that you can apply the punishment to those witnesses is only if we had not already applied the punishment to the accused. That's a big difference. So in other words, according to our tradition, if God forbid the Beis Din had got this wrong and they had executed this guy on the accusation of these witnesses, and after his execution we now find that these witnesses are false witnesses because they were nowhere near the place, nothing we can do to them. Gzeiras HaKosav, it's a divine decree, we cannot touch them. And the Tzedukim said, of course you can, kill them. So Yehuda ben Tabai, who was the leader at that time, stood up and said, because we're at war with the Tzedukim here, a case came before him, and there was only a single witness to the case. The single witness was then proven to be Eid Zoimem, not to have been in the location where the crime was said to have happened. And Yehuda ben Tabai said, execute him. Because the principle is that if you wanted to punish somebody else and you were not actually there, you get the punishment. Comes along Shimon ben Shatach and he says, with all due respect, my dear colleague, you're wrong. Because the Torah is very clear that Eidim Zoimamin, the only time the principle can apply is if they were a pair or more. In other words, they had to have been enough people to constitute testimony in the first place. One person in Judaism is never accepted for testimony of a crime. You've killed an innocent man in your rush to disprove the approach of the Tzedukim. When Yehuda ben Tabai heard this, he stepped down from his role and he asked Shimon ben Shatach to take over as the leader of the Jewish people. He said, because I've erred in this particular case. Now, if you look at Yehuda ben Tabai's teaching, you understand his thinking. Guilty until proven innocent. You see that in his Mishnah, that he leans towards placing guilt on people unless we can exonerate them. Shimon ben Shatach replies to that and it says, that's why you have to do a really good job of cross-examining the witnesses so you don't land up in a situation where, God forbid, you kill somebody accidentally. Shimon ben Shatach also had his own issue that flared up in his face. His issue was that, as mentioned, there was this terrible scourge of witchcraft in Israel at the time, and he needed to put a stop to it. Now, there's a halacha that says very, very clearly that you may not execute more than one person on a day. Clear. The Beis Din may not execute more than one person on a day. Not only that, but if they execute more frequently than once in 7 years, or according to another version, once in 70 years, we call them Beis Din Chablonis. We call them a terrorist Beis Din. Because in Judaism, we're not looking to execute people. I know people are always saying, Judaism believes in the death penalty. No, it doesn't. It really, really doesn't. It believes in the death penalty under the most incredibly exceptional circumstances. Shimon ben Shatach felt that sometimes you've got to do what we call eis lasos la'Hashem eferu torasecha. There's a principle in Judaism that says, and when there's a crisis in the religion, you're allowed to temporarily suspend a law in order to keep Judaism alive. So that's what Eliyahu did, the prophet Eliyahu, when he challenged the prophets of Baal. You're not allowed to build an altar outside of the Beis HaMikdash, but he did it because there was this crisis. Jews were left, right, and center becoming Jews for Baal, and it was a terrible thing, and he had to do something temporarily to set the record straight. Shimon ben Shottach does the same thing. He says, we've got a crisis over here. If we don't stop this thing in its tracks, we're going to have serious, serious problems. So we've got to do something. So immediately he went and he hanged 80 of these witchcraft practitioners, and they all, for whatever reason, were women. So 80 witches, he hanged them on a single day. It's a whole story how he got to them. He had to train up special forces of rabbis to be able to go to the cave where they were hiding, to be able to not be affected by their sorcery. It's a whole story, which is not for now. It's a fascinating story. You should read it at some point. But he hanged 80 witches on a single day. As you can well imagine, he had a big problem now. What's his problem? His problem is people are going to say, the rabbi did it. The Av Beis Din, the chief justice, was willing to kill multiple people on the same day. That implies that it's acceptable. Therefore he says, have a zohir bidvarecha. Careful how you do things. Dvarecha can mean your words, but also dvarim, the things that you do. Be careful what you do, because the way that you speak, and much more so the way that you behave, might teach other people how to behave. So he wanted people to know very clearly that I did this under emergency circumstances. It should not be seen or understood or misinterpreted as an acceptable way to behave under normal circumstances. There's a tragic end to that story. The tragic end is that the families, I suppose, or the disciples of these witches wanted revenge. And so what they did was they produced a libel against the son of Shimon ben Shottach. And they brought a case before the Sanhedrin that his son had done something for which the punishment was skila, stoning. And they did such a good job of building the case that the Sanhedrin could not find any reason not to accept it. And Shimon ben Shottach's own son was executed by his own Sanhedrin. After that, Shimon ben Shottach said, "Habe marbe lachkores ha'edim." There's never enough cross-examination of witnesses. People are so slick. They are so convincing. They could somehow convince you that what day is night. I mean, we all know of high-profile celebrity cases over the years and how they get away literally with murder. He says you have to work so hard that you don't only follow the legal requirements of cross-examination. That's the word marbe. And by the way, that's why it fits in Pirkei Avos, because Pirkei Avos tells us about doing things beyond the requirement of the law. So there's a legal level to which you have to cross-examine, and then have a marbe, you should increase even beyond that. You cannot exhaust the cross-examination process, because if you get this wrong, innocent people die. It's a shocking thought, and unfortunately something that he learned from bitter personal experience. Okay, so what can we learn from this? There's a nice story that the Gemara tells that Shimon ben Shottach was dirt poor. May or may not come as a surprise to you that one of the leading personalities of the Jewish community couldn't afford to live. Some things, don't know if they've changed much. So he really battled. He really battled. And what he used to do for a living is he used to go out and collect chestnuts and sell them to the population. Which is quite demeaning if you think of this is the Av Beis Din. That's what he did. And really bothered him. It didn't bother him that he was poor, and it didn't bother him that he had to work for a living. It just bothered him that it was such a long process that it wasted time that he could have learned Torah. Eventually he saved enough money that he could afford a mule. And obviously, if he had a mule, he could pack all the chestnuts into one load instead of going back and forth to the forest multiple times, and it would save him time. He could learn Torah. So he bought this mule. He arrives back home with all of his students in tow. And as he leads the mule into his house, the students are so excited. This is like a breakthrough. And they come check it out. It's like Lahavdil getting a new car. Everybody comes along and says, oh, look at this. And what do they discover? Dangling around the neck of this mule is a beautiful diamond. And the students are so happy. Rebbe, this is it. You're never going to have to work again. You'll be able to learn. You'll have no disturbance. This is the biggest bracha ever. And without missing a beat, Shimon ben Shotach says to them, the mitzvah of returning this jewel to its owner is more valuable than any extra Torah learning that I might be able to do with the money. And with that, he went back to the marketplace, found the person who had sold him the mule, and gave him the diamond back. The man was not Jewish. And he said, blessed be the God of Shimon ben Shotach. Because if this is the kind of morality that God teaches, halavai, I don't think he said halavai, but halavai, we should all be like that. That's what he says. Have a zohir bidvarecha. Be very, very careful with your words and definitely with your behavior, because the knock-on effect can be immense. Okay, still, what's the take-home lesson for us? Have a marbe lachkoras ha'edim. Do a good job of assessing the edim, the witnesses. What's the witnesses? The Gemara and Tainis tell us that koirois beisoi shel adam meidin olav, that the beams of the roof of your house will testify about you. In other words, what it's saying is that when many of the commentaries say, when Mashiach comes, what's going to happen? The prophecy is, Evan mikir tizak, that the stones are going to shout out. In other words, all the Torah learning, all the mitzvahs that you did in your house are absorbed into the walls of your house, and we just don't see it. One day it will testify. People will walk into the house, you know what they'll see? They'll look at your house. They won't see the beautiful furniture and the decor. They'll see the mitzvahs and the shalom bayis and the Torah that was invested in those walls. So the walls of your house are witness to you. This is incredibly practical advice he's telling us. Have a marbelach koras ha'edim. You want to get involved in somebody else's life. You want to make a business deal with them. You want to marry into their family. You want to become friends with them. How do you know? How do you know if they're the right people? How do you know if this is somebody who's wholesome in your life? Marbelach koras ha'edim. Go check out their witnesses. The Gemara says, what are their witnesses? The walls of their home, the ceiling beams of their home. Go look. What kind of pictures hang on the walls? What kind of books are on the shelf? That's the witnesses. You want to know who a person is? Look what kind of things they feel are important to keep in their house. You want to see if you should get into a business deal with somebody. Walk into their office. You see pictures of their family on the table. You know that this is a person who has the right values. You see Jewish books in their office. The person's got a Gemara in their office. Wow. Now you know that this is somebody whose Judaism isn't only reserved for the formal spiritual places. And the truth of the matter is, the Rambam says that Eidim, what are witnesses? Our eyes and our ears. Or as the Rambam puts it, he says, every one of us was an eyewitness to the giving of the Torah. You want to know how to be a decent human being? Have a marbel lachkoras ha'edim. Keep going back and reinvestigating the witnesses to your own life. That means to say that to us, Judaism is not a book on the shelf. To us, Judaism is dynamic, it's live. We were there. We were witnesses. If we were not alive at the time, our souls were there. So have a marbe, constantly lachkor. Lachkor means to investigate, to dig up. Constantly dig up in your life the consciousness of the fact that our Judaism is live because we're witness to the fact that Torah was given to us. It's not hearsay. It's not tradition that was passed down and kind of broken telephone. It's our first-hand experience. And that's actually alluded to in his name. Shimon ben Shotach. Shimon comes from the word shma, to listen. And Shotach comes from the word shetach or shatiach. Shetach is a big area. Shatiach is a carpet. In the Torah, we're going to read in 2 weeks' time in the parasha, Vayishtuchu lohem shotoyach, how the man was spread out over the ground. Take what you've heard and spread it out. That means develop it. Don't just learn something once and say, okay, I know it. Develop it. Marbelachkor, investigate it a lot. Spend a lot of time and attention on it until it is clear to you not only that you know the information, but much more importantly, that you own the information. That you know it as your information. I am testimony to this. I am witness to this. That way a person will be Zohir, Bidvarecha. That way you'll be careful with how you talk. That way you'll be careful how you behave. That way nobody will, God forbid, misconstrue your messages or your behavior, and people will only learn the best things from you, which ultimately is the goal of being Jewish.